do is recognize that the conditions that allow this terrible development to be built on the Bowlmor site could also allow many other similar terrible developments to be built in this neighborhood, and what can we do moving forward to prevent that from happening. But I'll go through that in more detail. I'm going to try to give information and answer questions about contextual rezoning and landmarking, which are two of the potential solutions to this problem. And then most importantly, and this is where the form that we gave you comes in, we, the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, we need to gauge stakeholder interest in and support for these measures. I'll discuss it in greater detail, but we think that this area deserves contextual zoning and deserves expanded landmark protections. It doesn't really have either currently. For there to be even a snowball's chance in hell of either of those happening, there has to be strong support from stakeholders, meaning people who live and especially who own property in the neighborhood. So part of the main purpose for tonight is to get a sense from you, if you are one of those people, how do you feel about this? What your concerns are, what your questions are, what you would or would not support. Okay. So let's first talk about what's going on the Bowlmor site, 110 University Place. The building is to be demolished, and it is to be replaced with a 23-story, 52-unit, 308-foot-tall tower. By comparison, the NYU Megadorm, as we sometimes call it, that was built a couple of years ago on 12th Street between 3rd and 4th Avenues, the thing that has the little church tower in front of it, that's about 250 feet tall. So this is awful. The way that this building will look is it's going to have about a 26-foot-high single-story base covering most of the lot, and then there will be a tower rising above that that will cover about a quarter of the site. The base will be a lobby with some commercial and community facility uses in it. The tower will be residential. The developer, in what I think he thought would be, news that would just win us all over, has said that he plans the building to be masonry, not glass and steel. That hopefully maybe is a good thing, not good enough to make up for the fact that this building is being built in the first place. And as it's been filed, it does not require any public review or approvals. None whatsoever. These are some images, and again, I apologize that the projector is not as sharp as it should be. These are images, just to be clear, that we have created, but using the dimensions of the filed plan, so there's no architectural detail here, but basically just showing you the outline and form of what it seems as though, from what's been filed so far, the building will look like in terms of the envelope it will occupy. So this is looking up University Place. Again, looking up University Place. So this is looking north, sort of the sky. Now, for what it's worth, let me just tell you, this actually could have been much worse under the existing zoning. These diagrams here show you the outline of what under the existing zoning is the allowable envelope that a building on this site could occupy. So if you look, and there's two different ways that they can do it. So if you look on the left, as you can see, the point where a new building cannot exceed is 740 feet in the air. Now, below that point, we're talking about a very, very narrow space. So on a practical level, nobody would ever build a building quite that high. This one is just above 300 feet, and you can see it says 119 feet by 80 feet. That's the size of the envelope within which the zoning allows you to fit a building. So this shape that's here is one of the ways in which the zoning determines what can be built, and it says anything that you build has to fit within this envelope. The one on the left is another version, because there's two ways in which you can use the zoning. This one, the ultimate height is 566 feet. Again, very, very narrow top, so on a practical level, the building would never go that large. For what it's worth, this only applies to the occupied part of the building itself. There can be things like mechanical equipment and other stuff on top of the building which actually can penetrate this, what's called the sky exposure plane. Let me also just mention, as you can see on the lower left-hand corner there, this is basically a residential building. In certain zoning districts in this area, in University Place and the Broadway corridor, which we're talking about tonight, such a building could have been a hotel or a dormitory. In fact, on this site, it could have been. So, a little bit we could say, well, there's some bright sides to this, not many, but also this is important to be aware of because this speaks to other things that could still happen in the neighborhood unless we change the existing regulations. So why is this possible? I think most of us are shocked to learn that it is possible to build a 308-foot tall tower in this area. So this is a map of Manhattan, and everything that's in this sort of light purple is designated historic districts. And again, I apologize if this is not as clear as it should be, but so right here is University Place. Here's a close-up. This will be at least slightly easier to gauge. So this is University Place here. This is Broadway, 4th Avenue, 14th Street. This is the Greenwich Village Historic District designated in 1969. So south, other than the west side of University Place, south of 9th Street, and then between 9th and mid-block, between 11th and 12th, these mid-block areas, none of this is landmarked. None of this has any sort of landmark protections. That's the thing that says you can't tear down most buildings. Any sort of changes have to go through a public review and approval process and are supposed to match the existing context and things like that. So on the one hand, there's no landmark protections for this area. And then, okay. So this is a zoning map of the area. Don't glaze over too quickly. But basically, so the zoning districts for this area, like this C17 here, C61, R72, and C62. I'm sure for 99% of you that means nothing. But very quickly, contrast it with what is over here where it says C62A. When there is a letter at the end of the zoning, that means it's a contextual district. A contextual district has height limits that says you cannot build above a certain height in this area. This neighborhood does not have contextual zoning. So as you saw, the zoning, while it does have some limitations attached to it, does allow for some pretty terrible stuff. So here is a general description of some of the zoning districts that exist in this area. First of all, they date to 1961. Back in the 1950s and early 1960s, people thought the best thing that we could do for cities was get rid of the old, low, compact buildings and in their place build tall towers with open space around them. And that's basically what we're seeing in the form of this new building. So the zoning has no height limits, it's non-contextual. Actually, there was no such thing as contextual zoning in 1961 when this was designated. As I said, it encourages tall towers surrounded by either open space or low platforms. It actually gives you a bonus, meaning you can build an even larger building if you include a plaza. This one doesn't, but it could have. And what that would have meant is instead of a one-story commercial base, there would have been just open space there, and then the tower would have been even larger. And finally, the zoning tends to have incentives for what's called community facilities. Community facilities under New York City zoning covers a whole range of uses, but the ones we see most frequently in our neighborhood are dorms and other university-related facilities. So in some of these zoning districts, you can build a building that's as much as 90% larger than a residential building if it's a dorm or other university facility, or a substantial amount of it is that. From our perspective, these are all extremely outdated notions that we do not think should currently be governing the way we regulate zoning in our neighborhood. And I'll actually just quickly, I don't know how well you can see this here, but you can see none of these zoning districts have any sort of height limits attached to them. Okay. So this is just an overlay of the historic districts on top of the zoning map. So basically, if there's no purple, and no suffix at the end, you have a non-contextual district and no historic district protection. So that's University Place here, the mid-blocks between Broadway, 4th Avenue, and actually even going up along 12th Street over to 5th Avenue, 13th Street, 14th Street, and further west. So that is why this is possible. And before I get too far from it, let me just say, we are going to have a zoning lawyer go over with the finest tooth comb this application to make sure that everything is in order about it. But I do not want people to get overly optimistic about that resulting in anything. We know that a 308-foot tall tower is allowable on the site. If for some reason the developer has done something that's sort of slightly wrong from that, we will do everything we can to catch that, but there's nothing, it would be actually foolish of him to do that, and there would be nothing to prevent him from building a 308-foot tall tower on the site. So here are the potential solutions. One is historic district and landmark designation, the other is contextual zoning. And I'm going to get into greater detail about both of these, but let me also just say this. So the way landmark designation works is it only looks forward, it doesn't look backward. So if a site is landmarked and the owner already has permits to demolish the existing building, the permits stand. If the owner has permits to build a new building and the site is landmarked, the permits to build a new building stand. Landmark designation typically takes a very long time to get to happen. He's already got the demolition permits. The permits for the new building are in the process of being reviewed by the city. They probably will be finalized fairly soon. Realistically, landmark designation is not going to save this site. Zoning also typically takes many, many, many months and usually years to happen. Zoning works slightly differently in that the way it works is you have to have started some modest amount of work on your project in order for it to be what's called grandfathered under the old zoning. So basically, if the developer knocks down the building and just starts to do a tiny amount of work on the foundations of the new building, if a rezoning comes in, he still gets to build under the old zoning. So it's really not realistic to think that these are going to be solutions, except I will just say there was one case where we were able to prevent a project that was in motion from being built with a rezoning. This was in 2008. We all know what happened to the global financial situation in 2008. This project went into limbo for a long period of time. They hadn't started work yet. During that period of time, we got a rezoning. And so the project never happened, still hasn't happened actually. A project could happen, but it would have to conform to the new zoning. Maybe somehow a million stars will align to make that happen. That's not something that's within our control. At best, what we can do is look forward in terms of preventing future such developments from happening, trying to make this happen as quickly as possible. If somehow, by some set of circumstances, this project falls into limbo, there's the outside chance that it could be caught. But I just want people to be very, very realistic about the chances of that and how it would work. So I know this is practically unreadable, and I apologize for that. So these are the old existing historic districts in our neighborhood. The stuff in green and this stuff here in peach, this is Gansevoort Market, the Meatpacking District, the Far West Village, the South Village, East Village. These are areas where GVSHP has worked to get landmark protections expanded over the course of the last 10 years. Actually, approximately 1,100 buildings over the course of the last 10 years, covering 10 different historic districts or historic district extensions. And these are contextual rezonings that we were involved in getting enacted. There were two in the Far West Village. Again, I apologize, it's very hard to see where this is, but this is between West Street and Greenwich Street. These happened in 2005, and then this one was in 2010. That's the one I was referring to where we caught the development. The East Village rezoning, we got almost all of the East Village rezoned in 2008, and then we got the 3rd and 4th Avenue corridors rezoned in 2010. These are all contextual rezonings. So, actually, I'm going to skip ahead and then come back to that. Our recommendation, and I'm going to go through why this is the case, is that we should pursue both a contextual rezoning and expanded landmark and historic district designations for the neighborhood, and I'll tell you why. Just in brief overview, and then we'll get into detail. One is, it's far from guaranteed that we'll get either or all of either. So let's say we say, this is the contextual rezoning that we want it to cover all of these blocks, all of these sites, we want it to do all these things. Maybe we'll be able to convince the administration to support it and make it happen. Maybe not. Maybe they'll support part of it, but not all of it, and some parts will be left out. Same thing with landmark or historic district designations. You can put forward a proposal and say, you know, we think there's all the best arguments in the world for why you should designate this a historic district. The city may agree with you, they may not, they may drag their feet for many, many years before they do anything about it, or they may agree with you about part of it, but not all of it. So if you kind of have a two-track approach, you're that much more likely to succeed at protecting as much as possible. And in an ideal world, you actually want to have both. So let's talk about what these measures would involve. So first of all, and again here, you know, I know it's harder to read than it should be. This is University Place here. This is 14th Street. This is sort of what you would call a windshield survey that we did. We've actually been working on the University Place Broadway corridors for a long time, being aware of the fact that it's lacking in landmark protections and wanting to potentially try to advocate for expanded landmark and historic district protections here. Towards that end, what we've been doing over the last several months is research on the history of every single one of the buildings, documenting when they were built, why they were built, who built them, what happened there, all that sort of stuff. Stuff which is very, very helpful towards the possibility of proposing landmark designations. And so the stuff in red, there's nothing official about this. Don't worry about figuring out which building is which, because again, this is what is sort of a windshield survey. But the buildings in red are ones that, at a glance, look like they could potentially be contributing buildings to a historic district in this area, in our opinion. Just to be clear, we're not the ultimate decision maker here. But in our opinion, these are all buildings that have some sort of architectural or historic significance to them that we would feel comfortable putting forward potentially, again at a glance, as part of a historic district proposal. So we do think that there's merit here to be able to do something like that. We'd have to do more work and get in a little more depth with each one of these buildings and make decisions about exactly what. So we also would strongly recommend considering a contextual rezoning for the neighborhood. And the way a contextual rezoning has worked in the recent past in New York City, the easiest way to get a contextual rezoning done is to basically take the existing non-contextual zoning district that you have and use the contextual counterpart to it. There are districts that are basically the contextual version of non-contextual zones. The simpler and the easier it is, the more likely it is to be successful. But there's one, so that's, if this was under the prior administration, that's the recommendation we would make. Under the new administration, they have made very, very, very clear that they are not interested at this time in any rezonings that do not include an affordable housing component. Now these contextual zoning districts, there are what are called inclusionary housing versions of them. So these are contextual zoning districts that also say that 20% of the units that are created have to be reserved for affordable housing. Our recommendation would be to say, if we want to go this route, we should strongly consider one of these inclusionary zoning districts, because I think it's going to be a challenge to get the administration's support for this under the best of circumstances, but for there to be any chance of it, I believe it has to have this affordable housing component. And let me just briefly run through with you what some of these districts are. So again, I'm going to read it to you, so don't worry if you can't see it, and it will be on our website. So the Bowlmor site is largely a C17 zone. No height limits. The way in which New York City zoning is determines what can be built is through one of the measures is through something called floor area ratio. That tells you how many square feet you get to build, and it's a ratio of how many square feet your lot is. So for instance, on the Bowlmor site, the floor area ratio you get to build a residential building is 6. So that means you get to build 6 times as many square feet as the size of your lot. If you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you get to build a 60,000 square foot building. If you were to build that building straight up with no setbacks covering 100% of your lot, you would build a perfect 6-story building. But nobody builds that way. So in fact, what you do is you have setbacks, it only covers part of the lot, it gets skinny. So hence, in this case, it's actually a 23-story building that goes up 308 feet in the air. Well, there is in fact a contextual version of the C17 zone, which is called a C17A. It has the same allowable size of square footage for a residential development, but it says the building has to come out to the street wall, it has to go up at least 60 feet and a maximum of 85 feet, and then it can set back and go no higher than 120 feet. So we're talking about a 10 to 12-story building, not unlike a lot of the buildings that are on University Place. So there's also, we have a C62 zone in the University Place Broadway corridor. Pretty much the same thing here. The allowable number of square feet doesn't change, but the height limits are put in place where none exist now. Same thing, 60 to 85 feet, 120 feet. There is one zoning district in this area, the R72 zone, that has a lower FAR for residential development, although it has the full 6.5 FAR for community facilities. So that's where you could build a dorm that's almost twice as large as a residential building. The contextual counterpart for that gives them both 4 FAR. So whereas before you could build 3.44 FAR residential, 6.5 FAR community facility, here you get to build a maximum of 4 FAR, whether it's residential or community facility, but the height limits are 40 to 65 feet on the street wall and a maximum height of 80 feet. Now the way it works with the inclusionary zoning, and you can see here if you can read it, I know it's hard, is that there's a different FAR, in other words, a different amount of floor area when it's an inclusionary zoning district. What they do is they reduce the amount of square footage that you get to build a residential building if it's purely market rate. So whereas in a regular contextual zone you get to build basically 6, they bring it down to 5.4 if it's all market rate, but then they bring it up to 7.2 if you include the affordable housing. My guess is under the de Blasio administration, they're going to make it so that 5.4 isn't even an option. That the only option would be to go the inclusionary housing route where a certain percentage is affordable, but it doesn't change the allowable height of the building. The contextual envelope remains the same. Now I know people often say, well, if you're getting more square footage, how is it that the envelope that you're allowed to build within doesn't get any bigger? So this envelope that they give you, the 60 to 85 feet on the street wall and 120 feet ultimate height, not every building has to fill out that entire envelope. And in fact, the idea is most buildings won't necessarily fill out the entire envelope. But if you have more square footage, you're a little more likely to fill out more or even all of that envelope. But the ultimate height limits and the ultimate limits of how big the building can go still remain unchanged. And I'm going to give you, just in case you're like thinking I can't visualize that, I'm going to give you some visuals to show you what that looks like. So first of all, so that's the mega dorm on 12th Street. These are some other NYU dorms on 3rd Avenue built under the old zoning for 3rd Avenue, which is basically more or less the same zoning on much of University Place and Broadway. Here's another view of that, and here, this is 3rd Avenue looking west across 11th Street. This is the side of that dorm. And this is the side of the new school dorm. You can see it's set back, it's got this open space in front. These two buildings really stick out like a sore thumb. Again, in a zoning district basically the same as what is there now. So we got that area rezoned. As folks probably remember, there used to be this parking lot here on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 12th Street with these couple of abandoned tenements. As you may also know, there is a new building going up there. It's pretty much done. It's got the West Side Market in the base. It's pretty much by coincidence, virtually the exact same height as the building next to it over here and next to it over here. This was built under the new contextual zoning that we got for 3rd and 4th Avenues. This is the type of contextual zoning that we are suggesting we pursue for University Place and the Broadway corridor. So this gives you a real-life sense of what such a rezoning would allow and require in this area. So again, compare this building here to these buildings. These are a lot taller, a lot more out of place. There's a variety of reasons why that's the case, but they definitely, they have no height limits. They stick out like a sore thumb, and I would say this is vastly preferable. Okay, so here's some drawings from actually the Department of City Planning showing. So this is in R72 and C61 zones, again, the zoning districts that are on University Place and Broadway, what can be built. Here's an image that shows a 19-story tower with a 1-story base. It's actually just slightly smaller than the one that's being built at the Bowlmor site. Here you have a 6-story base and then a setback that goes up about 11 stories. In total, and here you have an 18-story building sandwiched in between these two much lower buildings. This is what the existing zoning encourages. By contrast, if we were to get the rezoning, it would, in the case of those denser zoning districts with the 6 FAR, it would require something more like this. This is between 60 and 85 feet here, a setback, 120 feet maximum on top. Or in the lower density district, the R7 district, where it would be a 4 FAR, what you have is basically a 6-story building with maybe 1 or 2 stories setback on top of it. Very, very big difference. I'm going to show you a couple more illustrations. Here we go again, same thing. So this is what you can build under the existing zoning. Here's one example. I believe this is something like 23 stories, 19 stories. This is what under the R7A, the contextual counterpart, you can build 6 stories at the base, 8 stories after setback in total. Same thing. This is just another one of the zoning districts we have, C61. Okay. And this is just a general explanation of what the difference is between the two. What we have now is what's called height factor zoning. It says put a little open space around it at the bottom and then build a tower with no height limit. The contextual zoning says fit it into the existing context of the neighborhood. Okay, so here's what a contextual zoning would do and what the advantages of it are. It puts height limits and envelopes in place. It eliminates or greatly reduces the likelihood of large-scale commercial and community facility construction. It doesn't outright ban it. There's pretty much no zoning district in New York that does that. But given that right now there's this big bonus in some cases for commercial development or for community facility development, it would reduce or eliminate the bonus. The bonus is the incentive that makes it more profitable in some ways and in some cases to go that route. Okay, here's what a contextual rezoning would not do. So it would not require public hearings, review, or approval for new construction or exterior changes, assuming that it fits the zoning. So zoning is what we call sort of a blunt tool. It gives you a set of rules and it says, here are the rules, as long as you obey them, you get to do whatever you want to do in terms of new building and new construction. It does not affect the design of a new building beyond the height and the envelope. So it doesn't say, well, it's got to use these materials, it's got to look this way. It doesn't regulate that at all. It doesn't prohibit the demolition of existing historic buildings, although I will say, in a lot of cases, contextual zoning eliminates the incentive for their demolition, because what it does is it basically says, it ends up saying the building that you would build in its place is only as big or maybe even smaller than the building that's there now, so why would you want to demolish it? But it doesn't outright prohibit it, and it wouldn't do that in every single case. It certainly would make demolitions less likely, but it doesn't directly outright prohibit them. And it does not prohibit the elimination or alteration of architecturally or historically significant features of existing buildings. We've all seen this. Sometimes you have a beautiful old building and they strip away the ornament, they put a very garish storefront in, something like that. This would not affect that at all. So that's contextual zoning. It's got some really good things it would do, a lot of really important things that it does not do. This is what landmarking or historic district designation would do. It would require public hearings, review, or approval for any new construction, major exterior changes, or demolition. You have to apply. You have to submit this very detailed application. The application has to get a public hearing at the community board and then at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. All of us can be informed about what the application is. We can look at it, we can weigh in on it, we can organize our neighbors around it, we can rally people to say, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing, it should be changed, it should be allowed, it shouldn't be allowed. It does prevent the demolition of existing historic buildings. The Landmarks Preservation Commission can say, no, you cannot demolish that. This is part of a historic district and there's a reason why it's in there. And it does prevent the elimination or alteration of architecturally or historically significant features of existing buildings. So it keeps you from stripping off those details, and it also keeps you from inserting into buildings things like garish storefronts, just to use as an example. But here's what landmarking or historic district designation does not do. It does not affect uses, so it doesn't give any direct disincentive for dorms or hotels. If the zoning allows it, the zoning allows it. And it does not put in place specific height limits for new construction or additions. It's basically a subjective evaluation that the Landmarks Preservation Commission makes in any individual case, any application, to say whether or not somebody wants to add something onto a building, if somebody wants to build a new building, whether or not it's appropriate in terms of its height or scale, as opposed to the contextual zoning that says this is the absolute limit. I will say, generally speaking, but not always, in terms of size of new construction, landmark designation tends to be more restrictive in effect in terms of what the commission will do, but that's not an absolute rule. So just to be clear about that. All right, so what's needed for rezoning, if in fact this is something that we want to do? Now the stuff that's in italics is sort of the soft stuff, meaning these are the things that would really make the effort more effective, and the stuff in bold is what you absolutely need in order for it to happen. So in order to get a rezoning, you need broad support from stakeholders. If you're not coming into it saying, look, here's all the people who are affected by this and they really want it, your chances are pretty limited. Community board support, incredibly important. If we're not able to come up with something that the community board is able to support, its chances of success are very, very limited, and the community board is going to want to know whether or not there's broad stakeholder support, for instance. Local elected official support, especially the city council member. And we've been working very closely with Councilmember Rosie Mendez. We've worked with her on other contextual rezonings and landmarking efforts. I'm not going to in any way say that she will or won't support X or Y. She tends to be very supportive of these. She's been very encouraging of us to move forward with this dialogue and to try to see if there can be a consensus around these sorts of proposals. So I will just say I feel very good about the chances of our having her support on a specific proposal if we get to that point. So then what you need to do, and this is the absolute necessity, you need to get the Department of City Planning, which is a city agency, to agree to take on the rezoning. They actually become the applicant for the rezoning, and then you need to get them to vote to approve it. If they take it on, they're going to vote to approve it. It's a long, complicated process. After that, it goes to the borough president, who issues an advisory opinion. It's only advisory, though important. That's why I put it in italics, not bold. And then ultimately it has to be approved by the city council member. By the city council as a whole, it's fairly rare that if the local city council member supports it, that the full city council doesn't. That's one route. This is the route that you want. This is a very, very difficult and time-consuming route, but it's the easier of the two possibilities. That's why there's an or at the bottom. You can go the route of a private rezoning application. So that means the city says, you know what, we're not interested in being the applicant. We're not interested in using our resources to make that happen. any resident of New York City, any, I believe, community organization can actually file for a rezoning. So a private entity, such as GVSHP, for example, we've never done this, can file an application and takes on the expense and the burden of being the applicant. It is extremely expensive, and it is an enormous, enormous amount of work for a private entity to do it. Really, almost always it's only done by a developer or a real estate interest who A, has a lot of money, and B, is going to make a lot of money off of the rezoning, so they can afford to invest the money in the rezoning application to do it. Were we to do this, and again, we've never done it, and I'm not saying that we necessarily even could, but we would, if worse came to worse, we would consider that option. We wouldn't be getting anything financially out of it, so it would be an enormous investment. It would still need broad support from stakeholders. It would still need community board support. It would still need local elected official support, especially the city council member. It still needs to go to the City Planning Commission to get their approval, even if they're not the applicant. So one of the downsides is if city planning is saying, look, we don't want to be the applicant, that tells you that they have some issues with it, and eventually they're going to have to vote on it. Now sometimes they may say, look, you know what, we don't want to put any resources into this and we don't want this to happen, but if it comes before them, it would be too embarrassing, untenable, unpopular, whatever, for them to vote it down. So you may be able to, in fact, get it approved, even if they say, we don't want to be the applicant. But again, this is not your first choice scenario. Borough President still issues an advisory opinion. City Council still must vote to approve it. What is needed for historic district designation? Well, you need a strong argument for designation that's reflected in the history and architecture of the buildings, backed up by research. As I said, we think it's there. This is an art, not a science. It's not like we can say, yes, we've discovered X, Y, and Z, and because there's X, Y, and Z, this merits historic district designation. We certainly feel that there could be a good argument to be made here. One of the challenges is it's a sort of heterogeneous area, so it's not like you could easily say, well, you know, this is just all row houses that were built at this time reflecting this specific thing. It's a beautiful area, but it's a mixture of row houses and interwar apartment buildings and commercial buildings and old hotels and a variety of different things. So that makes it a little more challenging than your sort of typical area. My guess is in a best case scenario, if the city were amenable to this, they probably wouldn't designate one single large historic district that encompassed the entire area. They might look at different pieces, different buildings on different bases. That's just my speculation at this point. You need broad support from stakeholders, so again, that's critical no matter what. Community board support, very important. Local elected official support, especially the city council member. Ultimately, really what it comes down to is getting the Landmarks Preservation Commission to approve it. That again is a city agency, so again we're talking about whether or not this is something the administration would be willing to do. And ultimately the city council has the power to overturn it, so you need them to not do that. So you need the city council member, the local council member to support it. Timing. For rezoning, in a best case scenario, you're talking about over a year. Let's say, you know, we come out of this room tonight and we're like, yes, we want a rezoning. We all agree on the zoning districts. We're 100% on board. Go. And the city says, we've been waiting for you to tell us that that's what you want. You know, let's do it. It's in that case, and it's not going to be that case, believe me. We're talking about a year. In all likelihood, much, much longer. There is this clock that's attached to what's called the ULUR, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, that takes about 7 months to the steps that you have to go through. And then before that, there's all this environmental review and evaluation that has to take place. So, as I said, if, you know, tomorrow, every star aligned and we were moving along, we're talking about a year, and that's not going to be the case. It's going to, in a best case scenario, be a while to get there. Timing for historic district designation. Now, there's no time clock attached to that, but you know, as I said before, we've successfully pushed for quite a few historic districts in our neighborhood over the last 10 or so years. Under the prior administration, it really remains to be seen what this administration is going to be like. In those cases, in the best case scenarios, it took about 3 years to get a historic district designated. That was the quickest. That's how long it took us between proposing the meatpacking district for designation in 2000 and it being designated, although I will say there was time before that where we were sort of organizing people, getting consensus, things of that nature. We, on the other hand, we've been pushing to get the South Village landmark since about 2002. We submitted a formal proposal at the end of 2006. Phase 1 was designated in 2010, so about a third of it. Phase 2 was designated at the end of 2013. Phase 3 we're still fighting for. So that kind of gives you a sense of the time. And we're actually looked at, I can proudly say, in the city of New York, as being probably the most successful group in terms of getting historic district designations to happen and to get them to happen as quickly as possible. So that gives you a sense of this is really not a quick process. So there's the final reminder, which is that it is absolutely essential that you fill out those forms and give them back to us, because we need to hear from you now. So you've seen the presentation, you've seen the arguments. I want to have now do question and answer, hear feedback, hear what you want to know more about, etc. But we need to get from you in writing what your thoughts are about each of these possible scenarios and who you are. Are you somebody who lives here? Are you somebody who owns a unit? Are you somebody who, or an individual property? Are you somebody who's connected to a block association, a condo board, a co-op board? These will be critical for us in terms of evaluating what the potential is for successfully moving ahead with any of these possibilities. So that's the end of my presentation. I appreciate it. This gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Craig Keel. I'm from the University Place. Thank you very much for a really clear presentation. I love it. You've done all the aspects very good. I have a question about the Bowlmor site. I want to make sure I understood that one piece. If they chose to build a building that conformed to the contextual zone, they could choose to do, would they still achieve the same number of square feet as they're going to stop?
Yes. Andrew, can you repeat the question, please?
Okay.
Thank
you.
The
question is, if they were, for the Bowlmor site, if they were to build something that's a more contextual design, and you know, I don't know if you're very knowledgeable about zoning or you just happen to ask what's actually a very insightful question about this, but I didn't even mention this, but so the way the existing zoning works, there is actually the possibility of building according to basically what's more or less a contextual version of the zoning. It's what's called quality housing. We had reached out to the developer early on and we said, look, go the quality housing route. If you go the quality housing route, it automatically allows you to use all of your residential square footage, and in return, you just have to keep it to that 120-foot height limit. You know, and that would be great. You'd get all your square feet. It would fit in with the neighborhood. People would love it. People would love you, etc. He chose not to do that. And in fact, under the tower version, sometimes you, for a variety of complicated reasons, sometimes you can't always get all of the square footage that you're entitled to squeezed into that tower shape. If I'm not mistaken, I think he did. But the fact of the matter is that if he had wanted to go the 12-story route, the 10 or 12-story route or whatever, he could have gotten the same number of square feet in there, but he chose not to because it's just an option. With the contextual zoning, it's not an option, it's a requirement.
To follow up?
Yes.
Is there any, I mean, you probably know something about the developer, is there any chance that neighborhood pressure might persuade him that he'd be a lot better off?
The simple answer is, my guess is no. He's met with elected officials. We've written to him several times. We've been through a lot of these things. A lot of developers actually revel in the publicity that can come from the neighborhood saying this is going to stick out like a sore thumb. It's great publicity for them. It lets everybody know that this is going to be this standout development in the neighborhood that's going to tower over the rest of the neighborhood. Let me just say, if we thought that, you know, sort of public pressure or public shaming would affect this, we would not be shy about doing it. Trust me. We've done it. We've been there. We've talked to a lot of people about this. We do not get the sense that that is likely to have any beneficial impact. And we keep an open mind about that, but unfortunately I don't think so. He's, from what I understand, he has not been willing to meet with us, but from what's been reported to us by the elected officials, he seems pretty firm about his plan. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain about air rights and what, because people talk about it all the time?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Behind air rights. I don't understand.
Yeah, it's complicated, and it's actually, air rights is sort of a colloquial term. It doesn't actually have a, the question was, what are air rights and how do they work? So what I will say, so air rights really is sort of a colloquial term. It doesn't have a strict definition. A lot of people use it to mean different things, but one of the things that it can mean, and one of the things that is allowed in New York City zoning is, so in these non-contextual districts like we have in this neighborhood, you get this sort of, you saw that kind of pyramid that the zoning says you can build within that. So as I explained, you get a certain number of square feet based on your lot, but you can actually buy air rights, as they're sometimes called, or development rights from neighboring lots, which allows you to fill up more and more of that pyramid and go bigger and bigger and higher. Because the only ultimate limit in terms of the size of your building is that very, very large pyramid that we were looking at before in a non-contextual zone. However, in a contextual zone, because it does in fact put in place, these absolute, we're almost there, absolute height limits for what can be built, you basically cannot move air rights around because there's a limit. There we go. So let's say with the existing zoning, such as in this case, basically the way you would be able to stack your building is about this tall, 300 feet. Well, there's still some space up there if you had more square footage that you could build. And with quote-unquote air rights, you might then go up to 400 feet, for instance. This development is not using any air rights in that sense. It's only using the development rights from the site itself, not from any of the neighboring buildings. If it bought air rights or development rights from the neighboring buildings, it could go even bigger. Again, that's why contextual zoning is good. It says this is the limit. You can't squeeze more air rights onto the site because once you've hit that 120 feet or 85 feet or whatever the limit is, you just can't go beyond it. So one of the things in effect that it does is it prevents the transfer of air rights. It doesn't literally by law say no air rights can be transferred, but it says you can't go bigger than this. And so it in practical effect prevents it.
But can a small building that's a co-op sell air rights and have someone build 40 stories on top of them?
Well, what a small building that doesn't use all of its development rights can do is it can sell its development rights to a neighboring site and allow them to use them on that site. In some instances, you can build a building that cantilevers or hangs over an existing building, and we've seen a few cases of that in New York actually recently, but that's only it's only allowable if the little building says, yes, you can build your big building over the sky on top of us. And in theory, that could happen in this area as well. That's very rare. That's very rare. Sorry.
I understand the Bowlmor site is an as-of-right development. And in the zoning review process, which is engaged now, or the applicant, there's a challenge, a zoning challenge that can be made after presumably the zoning will be approved. Have you been through that process and do you know any of the sort of dynamics of that? Is there any possibility that
Yeah, we are familiar with that. We have
Question, Andrew?
Oh, yes, sorry. So the gentleman asked, through the process of applying for a permit to build here, as in any other case, you enter what's called the zoning challenge period, which is when after certain things have been filed, there's a period during which the public can challenge the approval saying it doesn't conform with the zoning, make your argument to the Department of Buildings, and if your argument is successful, get them to not issue the permits. And so the question was, are we familiar with this? What are our thoughts about what it could do here? This is what I was referring to before when I said we're going to look over the application with a very, very fine-tooth comb. It's Because the zoning does allow this type of development there, it's very unlikely, given that the zoning would let you build a 308-foot tall building, why would he file something that doesn't conform with the zoning? But we're going to look to make sure that that's the case. But in the best case scenario, let's say he does do that, and we catch it. He'll change it, and he'll get approval for a different kind of 308-foot tall building. So again, I don't want people to have unrealistic expectations about the likelihood of that changing or affecting the ultimate outcome, but trust me, we're not going to let him get away with anything that we are able to catch. Gentleman in the back.
Yes, a couple of questions. The first being, I heard you say a couple of times that we're going to have one-story retail, and I heard from some sources it could be as much as 2. Just tell me that's not happening.
What's been described to me is a one-story base that would be consist of the lobby of the building, some retail space, and some community facility space. My guess is, given that it's like a very small amount of community facility space, it's probably doctor's offices or something like that. Now these plans can change,
right,
but as has been described to me, and from what I've seen in the very basic documents that have been filed so far, I believe that it is a one-story building, one-story base.
I just want to say I would fight extremely hard if I found out that it was going to be a 2-story, because then it's going to wind up being 14th Street on University Place. A comment that I want to make is University Place is the gateway to the village. It's like no other street that exists in Greenwich Village. And you cross 14th Street, the atmosphere completely changes. They even went ahead and made it into a one-way street. I remember in the 60s and 70s it was 2-way. You can't make a left going north, it's only one way. So they already made it almost into a pedestrian mall. And they are allowing this, and I just want to say something. Amanda Burden, who was the previous city planning board person, planning commissioner, she made a statement and she changed things that as of right is not as of right. And she chopped 5 stories off of a building that had an as of right because she thought it was too tall and wasn't contextual with the area. And I think that we should not take things at face value. And I want to say another thing. The corridor on University Place is a scenic vista, regardless of the vernacular architecture that's there, and it definitely should be entirely preserved.
Well, it sounds like you would be a supporter of landmark designation. Let's do that. I will just say, though, that, and I'd be happy to talk to you in more detail about this particular case, but in fact, if a building is as of right, by definition, that means the city can't say no to it.
And yet she did, though.
Well, we can talk more about the details. I think I may know which one you're talking about, and I think there were discretionary approvals that were involved there. But we'll talk more about it. Sir?
From a practical point of view, there are a lot of co-ops and condominiums that aren't going to be sold, and a lot of buildings around. What is available to be changed in the neighborhood?
Sure. Well, there are definitely some buildings that, so what the gentleman said was, you know, there's a lot of co-ops and condos, they're probably not going anywhere. Sort of what are potential development sites? Is that what you're saying? There are definitely some buildings, you know, there's, we all know on University Place, I guess it's around 10th Street on the west side, you know, that block front. On some of the side streets between University and Broadway where there are non-residential buildings, on Broadway as well. So there are definitely some buildings that theoretically could at some point in the future, whether it's, you know, next month, next year, or a decade from now, could in fact become development sites. Something like a co-op or condo, especially a larger one, is unlikely to ever be developed, although we have seen cases, not so much in our neighborhood, but on the Upper West Side and other parts of town, where co-ops and condos have actually built extra floors on top of their buildings in some cases. So those kinds of additions are also possibilities as well, if the zoning allows it. Ma'am in the back.
We definitely have in our neighborhood one of the largest transient populations in all of Manhattan because of NYU, Cooper Union, and the New School. And yet dormitory after dormitory after dormitory continually rise one after another. Is there any law that you know of that addresses the enormous amount of transient, certainly innocent students that we have to absorb?
Sure. So the question is there any law that would, I guess, stem the number of students living in the neighborhood, especially in dormitories? The answer is no. The only real way to address that actually is through something like contextual zoning that eliminates the incentive for the construction of new and additional dorms. But beyond that, there's nothing that says, you know, any one neighborhood can only have this number of dorms or this number of students or anything like that. Sir, in the front. Did everybody hear that? No. Okay. So the question was, from our experience, if you try to move ahead with pursuing something like a rezoning or landmarking, and you're public about it, might it not stimulate developers to move ahead more quickly with their plans? I'll say a couple of things. The developers are going to move ahead with their plans regardless, and it is a little bit of a catch-22 because there is no way to do this in a non-public way. So all we can do is push ahead and try to push ahead as quickly and forcefully and successfully as possible. There almost undoubtedly will be some losses along the way. There almost never isn't. But the alternative is doing nothing, which means that there would be nothing to prevent the developers from tearing down and building under the existing zoning in whatever way they want to. So I hear you about that concern, and believe me, I've been through the painful process of that happening in a few cases. But the doing nothing option, I would say, is not preferable. Very quick, and then this woman has been waiting.
Zoning and historic district landmark, does one affect the other in terms of progress? In other words, if we just go with zoning alone, and don't try to push the landmark sort of affect our ability to zone.
So the question is, if instead of pursuing both landmarking and zoning, if we just pursue one, would that be advantageous because the other one might interfere with progress on the other? The answer, I believe, from my experience, is no. There's no reason why pursuing one should interfere with the other. It's two different agencies, so it's not like they're going to say, well, we're already busy with this. And in fact, like I said, it's going to be tough to get the city to agree to either of them. So at the very least, if you're giving them two choices, you give them two ways of giving us something that might make us happy. And typically, they're looking for something that might make you happy. So, ma'am, thank you for your patience.
We've been talking a lot about height, and I think what we see with these very tall buildings is what happens on the ground floor. I think University Place has a very special quality. It has small stores, even in Bowlmor. So I'm wondering if, apart from the destinations, which is very disgusting, I'm wondering if there's some way that we can approach the issue of what will happen on the level, we see the bank, we see the damages, we're creating dead zones, and we don't need another CVS. So I'm wondering if there's any way we can implement what supposedly Gail Brewer proposed for the Upper West Side, although I haven't really seen any results. It's the Upper West Side where I grew up. It's the biggest horizontal mall I've ever seen.
Sure.
But is there some way we can, through another type of legislature, also say, okay, if you're going to build this building, we have small stores instead of a gigantic bank.
So the question, if you didn't hear, is in addition to what we've been talking about, the ground floor retail is very important. Keeping out big chains, more banks, more CVSs, keeping it small, independent businesses. So that's a really, really, really important issue. It's a sort of a citywide struggle at the moment. It's one that we have been working on. It's potentially possible to address through zoning, although so far, other than that one very modest but important measure that was implemented on the Upper West Side. The city hasn't really done anything about either prohibiting or limiting chain stores. I mean, in certain zoning districts like this one, there are limits to how big a certain store is going to be. So, you know, you're not going to get like an enormous big box store under the existing zoning, nor would you under the new zoning that we're proposing. Now, that doesn't mean you might not get a store that's somewhat bigger than you would like, or that's part of a chain. So I would just say this, we and others, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, are certainly working on ways in which we can try to address this issue to get it so that in various neighborhoods there can be, or even citywide, greater protections for independent businesses and small businesses. The tool doesn't really exist yet, so I want us to hopefully move ahead with this as quickly as possible, even as we're also looking at ways of addressing that issue and hopefully applying it to this area as well as other areas as well. Sugar.
Is there a issue with the zoning of University Place independently of Broadway, or are they necessarily bound together?
Well, so let's look at the zoning map. If we can make this, here we go. So University Place is largely the C17 zone, although if you get just 100 feet off University Place, and a little bit of the Bowlmor site does go more than 100 feet off, you get into the C61 zone, which is the same zone that you have over here. I'm guessing in some ways that the subtext of your question is, well, what if there's an ability to move ahead with University Place, but Broadway is a little bit more of a sticky wicket? Basically what I would say is this. I think we should put forward a proposal for this. My recommendation is, our recommendation is put forward a proposal for this whole area, the C17, the R72, the C61. If the city's view is, we like the University Place change, we don't like the Broadway change, they'll say that to us. And they'll say, we'd be willing to move ahead with University Place, but we might not be willing to move ahead with Broadway, or vice versa. And then we can all say, can we live with that? Can we do that now and fight another day for Broadway? Can we not? Are we gonna, you know, sort of lay down and say have the whole thing or nothing? But what I would say is there's nothing immediately that jumps out and says, you know what, Broadway's gonna be a lot tougher than University Place. We shouldn't attach the two. I think it makes sense as a starting point, and based on whatever kind of feedback we do or don't get from the city, we can figure out how to move forward from there in terms of what they may say they're more open to or less open to.
Now, would that be a very rapid kind of response, or would that take them 6 months to research?
It really all depends. What I would say, there's no way of knowing for sure. I think that if we attach some affordable, an affordable housing inclusionary component to it, it's a little more likely to get their attention. We have proposed another rezoning to them in the South Village, which they've been extremely resistant to. It did not have an inclusionary component to it. We're still working on it, though, with them. We're still working on getting them to be open to it. You know, I don't know. All we can do, it's a new administration, all we can do is try and push to get it looked at and to get an answer and a response from them as soon as possible. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for all the work that you do. And it's
Here,
nice
here.
to see so many people show up. The question I have is, I live at 31 East 12th, which is right across the street from Bowlmor, so I'm on the 7th floor and I'm taking pictures and I'm watching the bubble come down, the little sky come up, and we'll see what happens. Rumors abound. I heard at some point that the project had fallen through completely and someone absconded with millions to South America. I wasn't so sure. Then I heard that they were not demolishing the garage itself, that they were actually going to work around it. That's not true, right?
All I can tell you is they do have demolition permits. They appear to be moving in that direction, but not very far. I haven't heard anything about the development falling through, and Mr. Macklow probably has considerable resources.
Just one final little question is just a technical one also, is the corner building on the southwest 13th and Deli.
Right.
Give me a lot of this false information on that. I've been told that they have not sold the building, and that's a little, you know, like thing on Macy's and 34th Street that never got sold. So,
Right.
do you know anything about that?
Yeah, a lot of people have been asking about that and have been
Question?
expecting. So the question was, is anything happening with the building just to the north of Bowlmor, the little building with the deli on the southwest corner of 13th and
One
University?
next door I was told was sold on 13th Street with Chinese laundry. She told me.
She's saying she heard that the one next to it on 13th Street with the Chinese laundry has been sold. What I can tell you is we check regularly to see whether or not any neighboring sites to Bowlmor has sold any air rights to them. There's a way that you can do that through the city's Department of Finance website. As of this morning, none had, although I will say that that website is very slow to be updated, so sometimes things may have happened as much as several weeks ago, and they still haven't yet appeared on that website. But according to that website, no, at least as of yet, and I've not heard anything from anyone that would in any way, solid way, substantiate that anything like that has happened.
So I'll wait for the next room.
Any other questions?
Is Macron subject to the low income?
No, the current zoning does not have any requirement for affordable housing whatsoever. Sir?
Well, given the way the Landmarks Commission is working lately, which is not doing anything really, slowing down a lot of development, what hope do you have of getting anything through Landmarks?
You know what, all I can say is we will try our best, make the best case, try to have the strongest coalition possible to push for it and do everything we can to get it. It's always hard. It's always a tough battle, and we're still feeling out this new administration in terms of how they are going to handle landmarking issues. You know, I'll just say over the last 10 years during the prior administration, we got a lot of landmark designations done that people said it'll never happen, they'll never do it, and in some cases where the Landmarks Preservation Commission themselves said, we're not going to do it. So now, I don't mean to sound as though if we move ahead, it's going to happen, because there are certainly things that we have tried to get from the Landmarks Preservation Commission over the years and have not succeeded in doing. All I can say is the only thing we can do is try as hard as we can and push as much as we can to try to make this happen. If there aren't more questions, I certainly would be interested to hear from people your thoughts about landmarking or rezoning and whether or not you think that would be a good thing, a bad thing, somewhere in between for this area.
Let's just have a show of hands.
Okay, we can do that. Good suggestion. So let's start with landmarking. Who thinks that landmark protections for all or part of this area would be a good thing? A lot of hands. Who thinks it would be a bad thing? That's fair. Who's kind of somewhere in between, or making up their mind, or wants more information and still thinking about it? Okay, great. Contextual rezoning. Who thinks the contextual rezoning that we discussed would be a good thing for this area? A lot of hands. That's great. Who thinks it would be a bad thing for this area? Who's still making up their mind, somewhere in between, not sure, wants more information? Great. Okay. All right. Well, I really, really appreciate that. Please do make sure that you put that in these documents. We want to hear from everybody, whether you're supportive, opposed, or somewhere in the middle. It's very, very important. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. And this is not the end of the conversation, but it is one very, very important step in the process. So thank you for